we're going to supply the burgers and the hot dogs and some chips, and we'd love to have just an old-fashioned potluck. So you can either, I think you can sign up online for that, but for sure you can go outside to the tent there and sign up. There's some suggested ideas of what to bring, because we don't need 100 gallons of potato salad. So that would be great, and we would look forward to having you join us for a great celebration. I usually don't point out guests, but I will pick on one this morning. I keep wanting to say my little nephew, but he's not little. Matthew is here for the next 3 months with me, living with his favorite Uncle Juno in California, as he is a pro golfer, or should I say he is a starving pro golfer, and he's from Michigan. And obviously in Michigan there is not a lot of golfing going on. So he is here with Uncle Juno to not teach me how to golf, because he'd be here another 6 months or another year, but just to get him through the winter so he can keep that swing going. And by living with me, he gets the privilege of hearing my ideas about the sermon and where I'm going. And he didn't beat me up with his golf club over it, as he heard some of those things yesterday. So I look forward to having him live with us and be a part of our community here. So, Matthew, welcome. Oh, and he's also a newlywed, believe it or not. Got married. Flew to Michigan, did his wedding a couple weeks after Mark's, and you know what? So he's over the other day. I'm going, "Where is your wedding band?" He's just like, "Oh, that's a whole nother story." So they have to buy a new one because he's already lost it. But so any of you younger ladies, he's married, so don't try to hit on him or whatever. His wife will appreciate that. Anyway, folks, we are in, as you know, in our series called "In Our Cities as It Is in Heaven," our vision series for 2016. And we started that, Mark kicked us off a little while ago. It seems like a little while ago. It was only a couple weeks ago, about the reality that God is here to redeem all of creation, the world and us. And we need to lean into that and to remember there is hope for everybody. Then last week, we were reminded of what the psalmist talks about in the idea of remembering. The idea of remembering God's faithfulness. The idea of remembering, because the people of Israel, they did some wonderful things and they did some not wonderful things. And the good news is that God was with them through it all. And so we took a walk down memory lane for us as a church, remembering almost 85 years of God's faithfulness through the beginning of us as Artesia Reformed Church to where we are today. And it is good to remember. And it's good that we need that reminder to remember God's faithfulness. Again, we were reminded we went from a small building to a barn, to another building that was then enlarged upon. We changed our name. We stopped teaching in the Dutch language and went to English. As we changed our name for the church, we changed it all so that we could reach out to the people around us. And it is just good to remember that. And that's why we revisit our vision each and every year, for the sake of remembering where we've been, remembering God's faithfulness, and help to make sure we're all on the same page as we continue to move forward. And so as we do that, as we think now about where we're at currently and what reality is for us as in our culture, let me pray. Again, Lord, for the people here, thank you. Thank you that they got up, that they got themselves together. For those who would have preferred to stay at home, thank you that they made the efforts to be here. For those who are watching us online, thank you. Thank you for their diligence to find us, to get onto that streaming service so that they can be a part of this family from their home. And so no doubt, Lord, I continue to pray. I continue to thank you that for the folks here, that as they come in these doors, they don't check who they are at the door. They don't lock themselves in their cars, but they bring all of them to this, your place. And so to that, I am thankful. And so I simply pray that the thoughts that are going on in their minds, that the feelings that they are feeling in their heart, that the words of my mouth will be acceptable in your sight, because you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So this morning, we're going to be looking at a passage in the Bible, in the New Testament, written by a man named Paul. We've talked about Paul a lot. We have read some of his writings already, and so we know that Paul lived, again, as a reminder, most of his life far from God. He was not a good guy from any standard whatsoever, and yet God touched his life, transformed him, and used him to write most of the New Testament. And that's where we come in today, as we are going to look at another passage that this guy wrote. A guy that, again, we probably wouldn't, most of us wouldn't want in our circle of friends, so to speak. He wouldn't be our call a friend kind of a guy. But because of God's power to change, he wrote most of the New Testament. So we're going to be looking at a verses on pages 797 in the Bibles that are in your chairs, and so you can grab one of those. You can take one of those if you don't have one. You can find it on your phone, or you can look at the screen. We're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 23. Again, Paul says these words: "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some." And he concludes with, "I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing." I tell you, folks, at times I think some of us think, well, it's a little bit of a tongue twister. I do what I do, not do what I do, because I do this, do that. And beyond being a tongue twister for some of us, and one of those verses, okay, let me read that again and again to see what Paul is going after. I want to focus in on just a couple things here. One is the idea Paul mentions in here, the law. The law. And Paul reminds us about following the law. You know, he starts this chapter is really after a segment in 1 Corinthians where there's just a lot of stuff going on, and discussions and conversations and trying to manage expectations. And Paul reminds us that because of Jesus, we don't need to follow the law. Paul reminds us that it's not his diet. It's not what he wears, where he goes, and what he does. It's not by following all those things in the law, but it's because of Christ that he is not a part of that law. And so for each of us, those are good things to remember. It's good as we think about our vision and moving forward, that we know that it's not by a list of things. It's not by, do I do this? Do I come on Sundays? Do I come to the fifth Sunday? Do I go to the leaders lab? Do I check? And then that's what makes me good enough for Jesus to welcome me into all of glory. It's because of Jesus in my heart that changes me that I want to do some different things, maybe change some of my habits. And so, as we think about the law, as we think about what Paul is talking about, again, Paul is very clear that he is not controlled by the law, nor does he can manipulate others because of his freedom. Because it's okay to do some things, he doesn't impose that on others. So an example of that would be in the freedom or not the freedom to choose and not to choose would be, despite my joking around about drinking alcohol, I choose not to drink. I don't say that doesn't make me any better than anybody. I don't think drinking is evil, and I will often, someone's had a little too much of this, and I just choose not to drink. I think it's because I was married to a Dutch woman, and it's just way too expensive for me, Man, that tab goes right through the roof when we were with couples that were drinking. And so maybe that's why I don't drink. I don't know. But for me to use my position as a pastor to impose that on you would be an improper use of God's calling on my life. And the reverse of that, if I felt it was okay, it is okay to drink. I just choose not to. Same thing with, I haven't had any soda for 6 months. I can make a sermon out of that one. And I could back it up with some scripture somewhere. I'm sure I could dig up something. But for me to impose that to follow Jesus, to love Jesus, you have to stay away from soda? No. There are some choices we make. And there are some freedoms we all have. And so again, as Paul enters into this, he does what he does for what he does. We need to be careful as believers out there that we are not imposing some of our own freedoms or some of our own choices on people. Thinking if they did this, if they did that, then they could come to church. Then Jesus would love them. Folks, we know that. We know it's really the other way around. That when Jesus touches somebody's heart, transforms it, then often the behavior changes. Also in these passages, we see 6 times that Paul is saying he wants to win. He's going for the win. I think Paul is a little competitive if you read this. 6 times. Let's look at those verses again. Verse 19. To win as many as possible. Verse 20, to win the Jews at the end of verse 20. To win those under the law, verse 21. So as to win those not having the law, verse 22. To win the weak. And then the 6th is implied in the words from the end of verse 22, is so that by all possible means I might save some. Folks, Paul is, again, going for the win, and that win is to save some. So he's not being controlled by the law, meaning he's probably not living in the box that some people want him to live in. He's doing whatever it takes so that some might be saved. He is not taking his task lightly. He is kicking Fanny for the kingdom. I often thought that should be our new tagline, and maybe use a different word besides Fanny. And I thought, that'll get some attention around here. But that's what Paul is doing. He's doing whatever it takes to win some. He wants to win more, save some, and by denying himself, so that at the end of our passage this morning, so that by denying himself, he may participate in the gospel. In fact, he is really saying there, folks, by doing all these things, it's a part of my conversion. It's a part of my salvation. To sit around and do nothing isn't it. But I am out there for a reason and for a purpose. And so that's a natural question that we need to be asking. So what are you winning more for what? To save some people from what? To participate in what? What's he talking about here? And so in order to understand that more fully, we need to just take a quick look at Romans chapter 5, verse 9. And this is what he's talking about here. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? How much more must we be saved from God's wrath through him? How much more must we be saved from God's wrath? And so that is what Paul is talking about here. Saving some, winning some, to save them from God's wrath. And that is something we don't want to talk about a lot. Oh, I tell you, it's a lot easier to talk about God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's love for us. That no matter what we've done, God can change us and redeem us. And that is so much easier to teach and to preach. And indeed, that is no doubt the gospel. But we sort of forget, or not forget, but do we really believe in God's wrath? That is the question. And so everything that Paul is doing, his laboring, his adapting himself to whatever his audience is, his humbling himself to serve, to become a slave to all people, is why? So that they can somehow avoid the wrath of God. When I was in college, there was a bumper sticker, so that would have been a long time ago, that said, Jesus is coming, and boy, is he, I'll say the word, ticked. And so I put that on my car, going to a nice Christian school. You know, I think people were more concerned about the last word in that phrase than they were in the reality that, you know what, God is a God that when he returns, for those people who have not opened their hearts to him, that have not received his good news, even though they may have done da-da-da-da-da-da, to those who are not living by his grace, they are going to receive his wrath. And I'm not quite sure that's going to be a happy day for those folks. For those of you who are married and you have kids, you know, how many of you said to your kids when they were misbehaving, you just wait till your dad gets home? I see some. And, you know, it happened in my home. Well, I was a little bit more of the softy than Bonnie was. But still, you know, you're going to have to talk about this with your dad. You're going to have to explain this. And so just carry that over to God's judgment. And while God so loved the world, when he returns, folks, there is going to be a wrath for those who have not believed. And Paul is committing his life to those people, to the people who have not yet crossed the line of faith, so that they can avoid that wrath. And I just think if we were honest, we would say that's a part of our theology, that is a part of our thinking about God, that we really do put a little bit more on the back burner. Theologian, scholar, and pastor John Piper says, most of us don't believe in the wrath of God. In fact, we have substituted the gospel as a psychological answer and strategy to help solve people's problems. Give them to Jesus if something isn't going right. Give Jesus your depression. Give Jesus your grief, your low self-esteem, your feelings of abandonment, your fear. So we've replaced the gospel, or have shoved it over into just a psychological category as to Yeah, this faith thing will help me to feel good. And Piper continues and he says, if the gospel had no impact on those things, it would still be good news. Because it's the gospel and only the gospel that delivers us from the wrath of God. And if we were part of a church back in Detroit, everybody would say, amen. Again, because it's the gospel and only the gospel that delivers us from the wrath of God. And again, folks, that is precisely why Paul does what he does. And he says in verse 22 again, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. That is key for us as a church. Again, friends, we all have worries and we all have health concerns. We all go through times of trying to make ends meet, and we maybe don't know where the next check is coming from. There are struggles in your businesses. Will you or won't you get laid off? And we all have grief of some kind or another. We will feel helpless. We have our kids rebelling. There are relationship struggles. Again, all those things are going to happen. But none of those will hold up to God's wrath when he returns. So the gospel, while indeed the gospel will help us through those situations, if it never impacted them at all, the good news is that it will save us from God's wrath. And that's why we do what we do. And that's why Paul gave his life and did everything he did. And that's why we must continue to become all things to all people, so that by all possible means we might help save some. That's what we're about. That's what we have been about for 84 years. But I think it is easy. It is easy to shift from being so concerned about others, we become more inward focused about us. It is just a natural thought process. My daughter texted me this week, Dad, I have an idea. And I don't know about you, but whenever she has an idea, it's usually going to cost me some money. And I says, well, I was going out for a walk. I says, let me get on my headset and I'll talk to you. And so she had an idea. And her idea is, let's go to Europe. Like she's tried to spiritualize and say, let's go to the Holy Land, Dad. You save your money, I'll save my money, and then we can go. And I'm thinking, yeah, like in 10 years, But again, it all comes down to, really, things change. And when I got that call, I thought, how's it going to impact me? I knew she was going to come up with something. Bless her little heart. My buddies would say, Juno, go. Mortgage the farm. How many 22-year-olds want to be with their dad in Europe? That's a blessing. Lean into that. I'm saying, show me the money and I'll lean into whatever you want. But okay, all that to say is, again, but it's just a natural feeling for me. How's this going to impact me? And as a church, it is very easy. And as a group of people, as just humans, how's it going to impact me? And so that is the point as we think through and remember God's faithfulness. We do remember, how does it affect us? And when New Life started and it grew so rapidly, things have changed since then, in case you haven't noticed. not just in our building, but in our culture. We live in a different world. And during the post-war, the baby booming years, there was a revival of religion in our world, in our country. We had won the war, and it was natural and, yes, normal for many people to simply be in church. It was natural. In fact, some would say that Christianity was the default religion of our country. That's what everybody believed. Churches were often in the center of towns, and everything and most events revolved around the church. Then came the movement of the 60s that some of us remember. It included the questioning of religious institutions, and we were all saying, let's give peace a chance, and don't box me in. Don't put a label on me. Don't make me wear a sign, or don't label me because of what I wear or the length of my hair. And many of us here probably remember those days. The resulting decline in religion stopped by the end of the 70s, and yet the desire for spiritual development and insights remained steady. Formalized ministry, even back then, formalized religion was being questioned. But incomes were raising, and the accumulation of things started happening more and more. And let's face it, folks, even now, when we're doing okay when it comes to our finances and we're okay with the things that we have, God somehow takes the back burner because we become independent. And that's what we're known for as a country. We become independent, self-sufficient, and we don't need anybody, let alone a supreme being, for my daily bread because you know what? My job is supplying that, so I don't need to pray as much. My kids are doing okay, so I don't need to pray as much. We just moved into a new house. We got the second car. I don't need to be praying so much. So the felt need to be in a church, to be a part of a faith, was diminishing more and more. Not that those things are bad, but we know that they create a false sense of hope and a false sense of security. And so over the past 15 years, religion and organized religion has continued to decline. Church attendance and prayer is less frequent. The number of people with no religion, no desire for religion, continues to grow. And fewer people will say that religion is an important part of their lives or their marriages or their relationships. And so it's just natural that other priorities, work, kids, events, family time, sports, even sleeping, takes priority over gathering together as God's people. We live in one of the most diverse communities in our country, and we'll continue to lean into that, creating a diverse community that loves God and loves others. Unless you move us to some suburban city, someplace besides here, this is where God has placed us. And so we will continue to lean into being a diverse people of God, appreciating the differences, but knowing we serve one God. Most committed believers want information, meaning most of you here would like more information. But those who are seeking, those who have no faith, when they come to a church, they don't care that the sermon isn't great. Some of you are going, yeah, Juno, you fit that category. They're not looking for the top scholar to present something. They're not looking for a musical performance from Broadway. Those who are seeking, as well as most of you here, if we were honest, are just looking for people who are people of integrity and vulnerability and authenticity in whatever we do. Those who are far from church, those who do not have a church, who could give a rip about Jesus, they're not the ones going through looking at their websites, church's website, say, where am I going to go today? What they're looking for is, what difference does a church make in the community? Do they bring any value added to the place where they are? They may come to a church if they've been here for a concert of some sort. So, for example, when we fill this place at the holidays with Valley Christian, and we bring out every chair we can. Folks, let's face it. Everybody in that room is not a believer. They all don't love Jesus. But Dina does an incredible job Dina oversees our facilities, of presenting this place and renting it out as much as possible so that those who don't love Jesus, when they come in here, they go, oh. It remains in their memory block, so when the stuff of life hits the fan, this has been a positive experience. Those who don't love Jesus, those who are far from God, those who Paul would be going after, again, they are really looking for, again, folks, it's what we're at. They're looking for a community where the young and the old interact. And we've been talking about that. We've been living that out for years, trying to be intergenerational. And we know, let's face it, that's easier said than done. But those who don't love Jesus are watching. They're watching. They're watching to see, are the older people in your church mentoring, interacting, having relationships with the younger? Now again, let's take a look here. We have a lot of older people. And it doesn't mean you've been set on the bookshelf for God's use once you retire. And we've talked about this before. But God has a purpose. And whether you're helping serve pizza to Ryan's kids, you're a sponsor for his youth group, you help out with the young adults, you make yourself available, all that. We're trying to get the young adults to help be ushers and greeters. All that interaction, folks, to the unchurched, the studies are showing, to the unchurched, those are the things they look at to decide if they want to visit a place or if they want to check out a church that is going to help them to stay. And we know that's easier said than done. But we continue and will continue to move forward with that. We know that it is God's strength and it is the power of the Holy Spirit that transforms life. It isn't my messages or Mark's or Ryan's. It isn't the building. We know the buildings don't do it. But we do our very best to remove any barriers, brick by brick, excuse by excuse, so that we become all things to all men. So when the stuff of life hits the fan, they know and they've heard about new life. If you look in the back of your program, you'll see our mission and our vision. None of that changes. The mission of New Life is to join God's work on earth by making disciples and equipping them to be Christ-obedient followers. And then everything that we do, we become all things to all people so that we can see a growing number of Christ followers creating communities marked by reconciliation, peace, justice, and hope. And is it natural to think more about me than it is about others? Of course. But we're going to stay on course as Paul has shown us, doing whatever it takes, living outside the box, giving sacrificially, investing in others for the sake of the lost. And that will be new life for the city. And do I hear an amen? Mark, why don't you come up here? Mark is going to share with us a key way that we are moving forward and grabbing the attention